Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to a Daily Maverick webinar, which is very special to me because it's with a friend and comrade of mine, Garth Japhet, to launch his recently published book. You can see behind him and in front of me, titled Like Water is for Fish, The Power of Story in Our Lives, which is published by Pan Macmillan. We're also lucky because, as you can see, we have the author with us. And for those of you who may not know Garth, I'll just say that I've known him on and off for, I think, probably 25 years. But he is a medical doctor. He's the founder of two very important organizations, which we will talk about in the course of the next hour, Soul City and Heartlines. And he's also just a health activist and a humanitarian and a generally very good, values-based, nice person, the type of person it's important for any society to have, and if possible, to have lots of them about as well. So I was very privileged to be asked to facilitate this afternoon's discussion, and I felt even more privileged to read Garth's book. I've read it over the last 4 or 5 days, and we'll get into it in the course of the next hour. But I just want to say that I found it, Garth, first of all, a beautifully written book, very evocative. Secondly, a very relevant book as it weaves your story in and out of the story of South Africa, particularly the story of South Africa in the last 30 years, but also in the way that your book brings us to really important values and touchstones and questions about who we are and about how we can best act for good in our own lives and in our country. So I found it a book that caused me to introspect about my own life, and I guess that's what you want all of your readers to do, and to think about myself in relation to my world and the world around me. And in that sense, I think, given where we are in South Africa and the world, it's very timely and it's very relevant. So for the listeners, viewers today, what we're going to do is I'm going to ask Garth to just tell you a little bit about the book and tell you about himself to open up a discussion. And then once Garth has done that, we will traverse some of the book's important themes. If you have any questions or comments to Garth, please feel free to put them onto the chat. And in the course of the conversation, we will do our best to answer those as well. So Garth, over to you. I know you're a busy person. You found time to write a book in all of your busyness. One of the themes of the book, or one of the things that you're doing at the moment, is running a project that you call What's Your Story? So, Garth Japhet, what is your story? And why did you write this book?
Sure. Nice one. But first of all, Mark, it's such a privilege for me to be interviewed by you. There are few people I admire more for your striving for justice, for rights, for the underdog, and consistently and very bravely over many years. And so, the privilege is mine to be interviewed by you today, Mark, and thank you for the work that you have done for many people in this country. So what is my story? Well, I suppose the key thing is probably to explain to you why this book came about, and to first of all sort of say that I, as a young boy, was deeply impacted by a series of stories called The Jungle Doctor. And now the importance of that is that as a young boy, I had dropped out of numerous schools. I had a very bad case of acne, I had braces, and I felt like a complete failure. I was particularly good at English and history and useless at maths and science, and I wasn't doing biology. So this is a great recipe for somebody who wants to be a doctor. But the series of books that I read at that point, at age sort of 13, 14, painted this picture of this heroic sort of picture of this doctor walking across the plains of East Africa, treating the sick. And it was a heroic adventure story. And I think when one is feeling less than heroic or adventurous, it's sort of the concept of being Dr. Japhet felt very, very attractive. So I suspect that it was less out of altruism than out of a degree of this is for me. And then, you know, many years, so by a series of extreme miracles, I managed to get into medicine. By the way, I fainted at the sight of blood, and right into the middle of medical school, I would faint regularly. I then, you know, finished, and I started to realize that the jungle doctor that I wanted to be was actually a myth. The story that I'd been sold was false, and being heroic in the way that I thought, you know, to go and save people and etc. The context that I ended up in, KwaZulu-Natal first, and then Alexandra Township for 5 years, it was a nightmare because it felt very much like being, you know, a machine and sending people straight back into the context that had created the problems. And in the depths of despair, and I write a bit about despair and how I'm medicated for the protection of the public. But in the midst of that, I stumbled essentially on how do we reach people? You know, how do we get across? You know, the biggest cause of child death under the age of 5 was diarrhea, and no child should die of diarrhea. I mean, I was running the peds clinic, and every single day, a child either dead or dying would come in, and I just thought, you know, how do we, you know, we patch them up and send them back. And that's when I stumbled upon the power of story and thought, you know, what if I, you know, I don't want to do like a dry, factual based something, because that doesn't work for me. I'm sure it doesn't work for other people. And so I started to, first through the Sowetan newspaper, to write, walked into the office of the doyen of journalists, Dr. Agri Caster, and said to him, I want to come and write for you. I want to write stories about health. And to his credit, he said, fine. No, I was just a young doctor from nowhere, really. And that, yeah, was the beginning of a journey that led to Soul City, now to Heartlines, and then more recently to this understanding that actually there's sort of 3 parts to this. It's about knowing your own story and the power of that, and then I found myself, so that was part of what happened in this period, to try and understand where I'd come from and why I'd had this, you know, all fall down in my youth. And then, you know, I was this concept of using story for change. And then actually, again, stumbled on another thing which we're using, which is, what's your story? Because in a country that so desperately needs understanding between people of different races, genders, cultures, ages, we needed to look for something that actually would begin to bridge the gap, and that was, what's your story? So those 3 elements, and I sort of woke up at 3 in the morning and thought, geez, story. It's been like this magic essence that seems to have been a sort of secret source throughout my life, which brings us to today. So I've given you a snapshot of my story, Mark. I don't think we've got time for the ugly parts, although I'd probably sell more books. I thought that if I did put in a couple of those, what a bodice ripper, it would. But no, that's the part I think that is significant for today.
Thank you. And there's much more to it in the book, Garth. You're quite modest, because I think one of the book's strengths is the way that it weaves sort of reflection into your narrative, your history. And in many ways, your history is an embodiment of storytelling. You created Soul City out of an epiphany moment, if I'm right, that came to you whilst you were a pediatrician, or I'm not sure if a pediatrician, but working in pediatrics at Alex Clinic, and witnessing how if only people better understood simple things about their own health, there would be less disease, less preventable mortality, and so on. And so your initial idea for Soul City, as I understand it, was to call it Dark City, and then you realize, no, that may not work, and you call it Soul City. But that then created, you pioneered together with your colleagues, who you recognize throughout the book, an organization that told stories about health through the medium of a soapy, through the medium of television, and used those stories to change behavior. And that happened at a very important time in our epidemic, in our lives, because of the HIV epidemic. It's your life, my life, has coincided with two big epidemics in this country: HIV and COVID-19. And then, Soul City, still a very, very successful organization, morphed into, or gave birth to, another epiphany, which was also about storytelling, called Heartlines. Will you just, because not everybody knows this story, will you tell us a little bit about Soul City, Heartlines, and why storytelling and communication is so essential to health promotion?
Yeah, as I say, I mean, I first of all, credit to my colleagues, Shireen Asden, Sue Goldstein, others. The one thing I've always found is that you can have a dream and a story and a vision. It's actually nothing without people who will walk that journey with you and build with you. So any form of success that we have is definitely a communal effort. But again, I stumbled on story because it was sort of saying, hey, doing the nurse talks at 3 PM on radio and gives you a bunch of facts about diarrhea in childhood for some reason doesn't resonate with me, and surely it doesn't resonate with others. And I grew up addicted to the radio soapies. I would bunk school in order to listen to episodes in the morning. And I sort of intuitively knew that there was a reason why dramas and soapies and things are in prime time. You don't, get your blockbuster, new drama at 10 in the morning. And that's the reason is that people love them. And so initially the reason to place these health issues in primetime television and radio, we also radio in 11 languages, was because I sort of intuitively knew that if you wanted to reach people, you had to go where they were. It was only in retrospect, and again, thanks to my colleagues who educated me around the science of why that is so important, that realized that it is the thing that changes people, and has been since we crept out of the caves. There is no society, no people in history who haven't passed on wisdom and what is normal and what is not normal, except through story. And it's probably only been in the last 100 years where we seem to have moved into a different era where it's fact-based. And lots of research around why story is the magic pill for change. A lovely story of a guy called Antonio Damaso, who is a professor of neuroscience in America. They did an experiment where people who've had brain damage, where the emotional parts of their brain had been damaged, they checked out their ability to make decisions and about anything. And they found actually that where the cognitive things around the ability to absorb and remember facts was still there, those people whose emotional part of their brain had been damaged were unable to make decisions. And so the neuroscience is really interesting, is that we are emotional beings. Just about all our decisions are emotional based. And yet we think as health promoters, if I tell you to wear a mask or to sanitize, that's going to change behavior. You know, smoking was a great example. Those horrible things with blackened lungs and it's going to kill you made no difference. You know, and I still see these packages when you travel. It made no difference at all, because essentially that didn't connect with young people's emotions. It's something that might kill you in 30 years' time. So there was a lot of science behind. As I say, it sort of happened in reverse. And then the difference, and I sort of talk about it a bit in the book, is like a fake and a real Rolex watch. Two dramas or two stories can look identical on the surface, but actually it's what's happened behind them that differentiates them. And that's the other secret to both Soul City and Heartlines, is that a huge amount of listening to trying to understand why people behave in the way they do. You know, a classic one from the first series of Soul City, where we dealt with breastfeeding, was that we thought as medical people that we needed to tell women to breastfeed. And we listened and found out women actually knew that. They had obstacles to breastfeeding. One is it's not easy. Secondly, if I'm a working mother and going back to work, I have to stop. And so instead of a message and a storyline that dealt with you should be breastfeeding, it contextualized into the young mother who needed the support, particularly in urban areas, of this community around her. So, you know, both Soul City and Heartlines are very rigorously based on a process. But at the end of the day, it all comes down to the same thing, which is that we are wired for story. We are emotional animals. We do not connect with facts. We are emotional people.
Yeah. And it seems so obvious. As you say, you discovered it intuitively, and later on you learned about the science behind that intuition. Somewhere in the book you talk about an evaluation you did of Soul City, where you found that Soul City's stuff on HIV prevented, I think you said, 250,000 infections or something. You know, there were very tangible results. It seems so obvious, and yet we don't do it still. And I guess that's part of your life's mission. I mean, you talk in the book, you relay at one point how you went to Davos and how you had a conversation with Richard Branson, followed by a conversation with somebody from the Gates Foundations, and how they didn't get it at all. And I want to just read that little bit, because I think it says a lot. You get, probably you're not a person who gets angry as far as I know, but you get exasperated with the Gates Foundation person, and you decide to throw caution to the wind and just give it to her as it is. And you say, I know I'm more likely to fall pregnant than to get funded by the Gates Foundation, so I throw caution to the wind. Don't you think it's strange that while public health invests heavily in 21st century science, its approach to behavior change has remained stuck in the dark ages? I challenge her. And as I read that, I thought of where we are with COVID. We are spending literally billions of dollars on vaccines. Put aside the equity and access questions for a moment. But it seems to me that the public education campaign around COVID is ignoring all the basics that you and your colleagues have demonstrated through Soul City and Heartlines and so on. Do you agree? And what do you think it will take to make people realize that, yes, facts and science are critical, but delivery of scientific knowledge of disease into benefits to bodies depends upon brain and emotion and engagement in people's context? How do we get over this, Garth?
Mark, I wish I knew. I mean, the frustration is that, you know, we are sitting with some of the best people in the world here who have cut their teeth on this type of work, and it's not just our government or anybody else. It's just the default position is give this to an advertising agency, and, you know, give them, throw money at an ad agency, give them enough. And I think part of the problem is that it's seen as fluffy. It's seen, as I say, you don't see the difference as the Rolex watch example, is that I put up a PSA or a billboard or whatever, and they can look, both of them can look brilliant. And the one is based on a deep, rigorous process of understanding how people are likely to interact with it. And the other has been put together by a junior person in an ad agency, and it looks really pretty. And I think that the problem is that, whereas I'm a doctor and therefore that gives me legitimacy to do certain things, there's still globally is this concept that, hey, this stuff is fluffy, we can't quite measure it. And that, I think, is part of the problem, is that, I make the example, I call it, we don't build cathedrals anymore. And the thing about cathedrals is that they were built over multiple generations. So the people who built them knew that they were building something that would only benefit people, in a few generations' time. If you had measured what they had done in that first generation, you'd have seen a bunch of trenches and a couple of stones, and you'd have said, these guys are a failure. And behavior is like that, and behavior change is like that, is that it's not do this today, get that result tomorrow. It's incremental. Again, the example of this guy who wrote the Jungle Doctor series, he wrote them in the 1950s. I hadn't been born then. And those stories have impacted on my behavior right up to today. So if you'd measured the impact of his work in the 1950s, well, there were children's stories, you would have said, have these impacted anybody? You'd have had to take me out of the equation. So I think there's this problem that we are, as long as, particularly people running the prevention parts of the pandemic, they need to see stuff and they want to see it now. And as long as there's stuff out there, that's the degree of measurement that we're looking for, as opposed to saying, actually, there's deep science here. If we invested a smaller proportion of this budget into a proper process, but I think it is because it internationally is still seen as soft, as not measurable, and not immediate enough. So, I've been trying, we work with the Department of Health. I'm on their sort of steering committee. But I think, we're seeing, CDC has just given Saatchi and Saatchi a big contract to do behavior change. Joe Public, no issues against them, but it's just solidarity has employed them to do this. There's just this, so it's very frustrating, bottom line, Still frustrated, still irritated.
Well, and still have to press on, I think. And we need a campaign around it. I think you partly answered a question from Ayanda Sitole. She says, what do you measure or quantify the success of a campaign when it comes to behavioral change? I mean, you can measure, can't you? As I said, I mean, there are measurables. Will you just say a little bit about the measurables?
Yeah, so they're actually very sophisticated techniques. That study that you were alluding to, that was a big study. It was €1 million. It was a group of different independent research agencies, and using a whole bunch of metrics that sort of take away what they call confounding variables. Was it as a result of this, or was that just were there other things that actually led to change? And a lot of it is, has to be reported change. And that's also a problem, when particularly dealing with sexual health or whatever, when people say, well, actually, did you use a condom? And the guy says, absolutely. Now, the skeptic in all of us will say, well, how can you trust that? But when the numbers are big enough, you begin to see trends, and you can discount for some of those things. So again, there is, rigorous science around how to actually measure the impact of these things. And again, all you can do is you can look at a snapshot in time. And I like this concept of a glass of water, where you don't know whether what you were doing was the beginning of the filling, or actually you were the drop that went over the edge and led to behavior change. But each stage of filling this glass is actually an important path in behavior. And whether you're the first drop or the piece that goes over the edge, you contribute to this process. So yeah, and it's fascinating and it's measurable, and there's plenty of evidence out there.
Thank you. Thanks, Garth. And thank you, Paswani and various other people have just commented on how important and influential Soul City was in their lives. We're going to move on a little bit from Soul City and Heartlines, although we're going to stick with the stories theme. I also want to come to a question, because telling a story also requires an ability to listen, and Laurie Lake has raised that question. It was something I was thinking about as I was preparing for this. But before I come to listening, I have another line I want to take you down. You know, it's the diversity of stories, isn't it? It's not monotone stories that move people. It's diversity. I mean, what struck me in your book, and you and I chatted about it briefly before we became live, you know, we were both influenced by Enid Blyton and by Donald Woods. You know, they couldn't be further apart. The life of Steve Biko and the murder of Steve Biko, and Enid Blyton's storybooks that we read when we were 4 or 5. But it raises another thing, Garth, that you're getting at in your book, which is you've shown through Soul City and Heartlines how stories is important, or Soul City, how stories is important for health. But you're also saying stories is important for connection. Stories is important for social cohesion. I think that's what you're saying. And our society is an increasingly incohesive, if there's such a word, society. I mean, you say in the book that telling stories is a vehicle for transformation. You say that categorically. I don't think many people would have ever thought about that. You say, well told, fact or fiction, stories have more power to shape humanity than any weapon or virus known to man. I mean, these are very grand claims for stories, but will you comment on them? And will you comment on them in the context of a society at the moment where I feel very atomized, where we're very atomized from each other? A person who is an employer doesn't know the story of the person's domestic worker. A colleague sitting in an office doesn't know the story of a person at the desk opposite them. Please just tell us about that, your thinking about that, and what the book says about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key thing is, as you say, we're becoming increasingly atomized, and not just here. I mean, we've seen it, playing out in global politics in terms of the rise of nationalism, of us versus them. Is whether it is the right and left in America, or radical Islam, or whatever, is the fracture lines amongst communities and people are immense. And obviously we know what our fracture lines are, and it doesn't help when politicians use those fracture lines. But we set about to say, well, what is it that an ordinary person can do? Because these huge issues, I think sometimes we're all overwhelmed by the scale of the problems that we face. And so it doesn't feel like me as just little me sitting wherever I am actually am part of a solution. And what we looked around the world to see if there'd been anything that the everyman could do to build understanding, to build cohesion, etc., that didn't require deep process with, really experienced facilitators. And we looked at Palestine, Israel, we looked in Northern Ireland, we looked all the places where there's been these, big conflicts. And we couldn't find anything. And then stumbled, you come back to this thing about knowing the person who works in the office next to you. We started at Heartlines once a week to listen to somebody's story. Each of us would take turns, and people were free to share as much or as little as they wanted to. There was no, tell us about your deepest, darkest secrets. And it was extraordinary. We stumbled on this, that there was a tangible shift within the atmosphere and the context of our offices, when it doesn't matter whether you're white, black, female, male, trans, whatever you want to call it, is we all have preconceived ideas of the other based on what they look like, what they wear, where they come from, how they speak, etc. And based on that, I put you in a box. And we're very good at that here. We're very good at saying, well, if you're white, you're this, and if you're black, you're that. We're good at that. And what happened is that the sort of aha moments and the connections, just basic things like, two women from different races talking about their kids and the anxieties that they had about, the schools, or talking about their parents, talking about their relationships with their fathers or mothers. Just realize there was just so much that connected us. And then misconceptions that, one of my colleagues is a middle-aged white guy, and there's the concept that all white people were privileged. And, he tells the story of deep, not just poverty, but also of dislocation. His father was murdered in front of him when he was 7. And a lot of people who'd seen him as this middle-class white guy, which had suddenly realized, that doesn't happen, but it does. And so it's simple, Mark. I mean, you talk about listening. We call it ask, listen, tell. If all of us were to just spend a little bit more time getting to ask, not everybody you come across, but just in the people that we interact with on a relatively often, just simply like, so Heywood, that's a strange name, Mark. Where does the word Heywood come from? And then you probably tell me a bit of your English ancestry, and it opens up a line all the way through to, hey, Mark, you and I must have coffee. And I don't want your CV. I know a lot about your CV, Mark, and it's an extraordinary one. But tell me about Mark's story. And that's the ask part. And then the listen, which is, I think, is the thing that as people we're probably worst at. I'm a bad listener. Is that listening? So first of all, asking does the Zulu greeting of Sawubona, I see you. Just by asking you, it's saying I see you. By listening, you are respecting and giving a gift almost to that person about giving them your attention. And then the final piece is being brave enough to interact with your own story and to tell a bit of it when asked. And part of the reason I wrote this book is, and as you will, maybe get to the mental health thing later, but is realizing that actually my story can help others. Mm. And even if I think it's not a very significant story, there's no such thing as a personal story that doesn't have a seed of truth that connects people, and also a seed that can potentially help somebody else.
Hmm. Thank you, Garth. That's very important. I mean, again, just reflecting on what you've said, this is a time of numbness, I think. It's a time where the things that are in front of our eyes are so shocking that we almost have to inoculate ourselves against fully absorbing their meaning. And it's a time where the status quo seeks to maintain the status quo by not having us think too deeply, by not having us make connections with the fact that the people I see as I go running in the morning, and there are numerous now picking waste, are just like me, and they feel pain, and they have children, and they have dignity, and so on. They have a story. And in fact, I want to go out and take those stories down, because I want other people to see that these are human beings with stories. So it's so crucial what you're saying. There's an English poet called Kate Tempest. I mentioned her to you, a lovely poet. She has a lovely poem called People's Faces, and about how she feels very despairing a lot of the time, but it's when there's a connection with other people's faces that she feels this shared humanity, and something lights up inside of her. And I think what you're saying is that we have to help people to those connections, and that stories are the vehicle to do that. But we have to, what you're doing with Heartlines is that we have to be conscious in attempting to propagate, getting people to think as you're doing with us now through these issues. You mentioned mental health, and I'm going to go there in just a couple of seconds, but I want you just to think one more thing, because Laurie Lake mentioned it. I think the shift from telling to listening is incredibly powerful. Garth, telling stories doesn't complete the process. It requires listening. I can tell and ear to closed ears that the story is untold. I worry at the moment that people don't listen, that everybody's life is so fast and busy and moving from one thing to another thing that they hear but don't listen, don't internalize. So will you just reflect for a moment on, is there a project, is there a you talk about cat's eyes in Garth Japhet's life, in maybe helping people to start to listen again?
Yeah, well, Mark, in terms of What's Your Story, which we've been now running, I think, in over 10,000 different institutions, churches, businesses, etc., our evaluation actually showed that the biggest area that we need to work on is to help people listen. So it's absolutely a core thing that we realize is, I think coming back to this thing about not seeing each other, and the reality is we're traumatized, and I think I'm scared that if I actually ask you, Mark, a little bit more of your story, what am I going to do with it? And actually there's enough trouble going on at the moment. So there's this concept that if I actually ask you your story, then I'm going to need to try and fix you. I'm going to need to help you. And so I'd rather not take that on. And yet, our experience is that, even like the guy on the side of the road who's begging at your window, is that just the saying, actually in saying, what is your name, is actually acknowledging that person as, that's enough. That is like, is worth more than money, is saying, I see you. And you just, as you were talking, it was reminded me of Davos, actually, where as a sort of so-called social entrepreneur that didn't own a country or $1 billion, whatever, I was unseen. I'd wander around between these people, and they literally look at your tag that says Garth Japhet, Heartlines, Soul City, or whatever, South Africa. It doesn't say Prince or Professor or Bill Gates or whatever, and they don't see you. And the impact of not being seen is actually quite profound. So this concept of you don't need to fix people. But it does take a degree of energy. And I think that strangely, the gift is to yourself as well. I now never meet with a new person and don't just start off with a couple of story questions. And it changes the dynamic, and it completely, it says, Sawubona, I see you. So the listening part of this is hard. But it's something like anything else, like riding a bicycle, that it's a skill you can learn. And if you want to, you can be a listener.
Thank you. Time is galloping away with us, but Andile Maposa asks an important question. How can we create safe spaces to share particularly painful stories, Garth?
Yeah, I think that's where, I think there's different levels of getting people's stories. There's the level which is the sort of brief, what's your name, where do you come from? And then there's the really wanting to get a group of people together. And the safe spaces, I think, is very much created by your own demeanor. The way in which I ask you your story and not being judgmental and actually listening. The best psychologists actually spend 98% of their time listening. They don't, butt in and say, but that or that is. So I think safe space is created often by the listener. And that's you, that's me, is that if I'm not there, I'm there to listen, not to judge, and not to fix either.
Thanks. Then two other quick questions. Kulile and Komalo, is Soul City still on air? Is it still on SABC? Can you just answer that? And then Laura McCulloch from London, can you send any info about Heartlines? Laura, I think Heartlines has a website, but Garth will answer that. Just answer those two questions. You answered one.
So unfortunately not. Soul City and Soul Buddies, I think the last series of, I don't know, 5, 7, 8 years ago, which is a real pity, but I left Soul City in 2008, and it's morphed into doing extraordinary work, but in slightly different areas and not using story. So that's not happening. In terms of Heartlines, yeah, you just Google us, Google Heartlines. We were Hotlands initially, and then found out that it was a den of ill repute in Hillbrow. So we had to change our name.
Okay, we're getting lots of questions, and I'm wanting to move on to another aspect of the book. But Anne Pretorius, we work amongst the poor and need opportunities to tell their amazing stories. Exactly, Anne. Garth hears you, I hear you. I try to do it in Maverick Citizen. If you read Maverick Citizen today and yesterday, you'll see a number of stories by people who are homeless telling their stories. They have huge stories to tell. And we must bring all of these voices out. Craig, what are examples of introduction story questions? Garth, do you have a quick answer to that?
You can go onto our website. There's whatsyourstory.org.za, but there's lots of different ways of doing it. There's, if you're doing it formally, you can get, bring your favorite object and talk about that, or tell us about a book that you loved reading and why. What is the origin of your name? There's a bunch of them, but you can, if you go onto Heartlines' website and put in "What's your story," there are a whole lot of resources that can help with this. Mark, the thing that are coming back to and about the work that you're doing with Daily Maverick Citizen, I think, you talk about where we are as a country. I think one of the tragedies is that we're exposed to all basically, to call a spade, crappy stories. The stories that make us feel awful. And that's why it's so important actually to reach out around you and hear these stories of amazing people. The work you're doing to, and the Good Things guy who I interviewed for the book is that it's another reason to hear people's stories, because it actually makes you feel there are extraordinary people out there, and a few people stuffing up the country does not mean that the people out there are any less. So I think it's great for us to get to know people's, more of the stories around us. Exactly,
and it empowers us and it gives us strength, all of us. I mean, I'm lucky at the moment that I get to tell these stories, and I must say, one of the things I often ask myself is, when there is so much good around and it's all around you, why is it that bad keeps on triumphing? Now, I don't want you to try and answer that, but I work in Hillbrow, I work in Bertram's, I work in Orange Grove, meet people, talk to people. It's amazing what is happening, and it builds confidence and your power. But we're trying to tell those stories. So I'm not here to punt Maverick Citizen. I'm here to punt like water is for fish. But look at what we're telling people on a daily basis. But now on to another very serious issue, Garth. Your book deals very honestly with your issues with your mental health. And I found it very brave and necessary, the way that you did that, because mental health is almost like HIV was or still is, something we don't talk about, we don't admit to, and yet it's probably more prevalent mental illness in our society today, and COVID has made it so much worse than HIV. Will you talk about yourself and mental health issues and the broader issue of mental health for our society?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And I, I'm on a mission to say this is not brave. This is about, it's ridiculous that what is essentially something that affects 1 in 3, 1 in 4 people, that we don't talk about it. And my own journey was sort of started off with being, as a young boy, exceptionally anxious, and that led me down a whole rabbit hole, and led me to dropping out of schools, and then eventually, so that was a key underlying thing, and I couldn't understand. I was never bullied once through school. I mean, I would always say that if I was a bully, I'd have bullied me, but I wasn't ever bullied. So I needed to understand, and it drove a lot of my choices. and the dark places that anxiety often sparks depression, and it's actually the most difficult form of depression to treat. And so I needed to understand, because of a whole lot of life choices, and then in my sort of late 20s, coming out of a sort of war zone at KwaZulu-Natal, which I talk about in the book, I literally had a breakdown. I just could not anymore. And it was the first time that I sought sort of psychiatric help that diagnosed the fact that I have anxiety and depression that needed treatment. And so, I've been on treatment ever since. And what I think is difficult is that if you look at me, or you look at anybody, is that mental health does not bleed. Mental health does not have a broken arm. These things we can see, and we can fix. Whereas mental health is unseen. And it's often this thing of, we'll pull yourself together because there's nothing wrong in your life. It's just so difficult. And so that's where the stigma comes in, is that because it's not tangible, it's not observable, you can't immediately get your hands around it. So I think that's one of the problems. And the other thing is that it's a weakness, is that you are weak if you have mental health issues. So I'm very open about it. And I mean, I call it stuffed head syndrome, which is essentially which I'm going to trademark, by the way, unless the psychiatrists get hold of it first. But it has driven so much of my choices and who I am. And I think we need to talk about it because, again, it's about listening to my story, and it's understanding that does not make me, it's like, somebody with diabetes doesn't feel like, well, there's stigma against me, I can't talk about my diabetes. It's exactly that. It's a chronic illness. And part of healing actually is that we talk about it. So yeah, I'm medicated for the protection of the masses.
Yeah, and you say that in the book a number of times, that you're medicated for the protection of the masses, but you also tell a very, again, you make these issues into stories. You tell a very poignant story. I've forgotten the person's name, I should know, because I only read it a few days ago, John or Jeff, who came to you after you'd given a presentation, and you draw an analogy with diabetes. How do you tell if a person has diabetes? Do you want to say a little bit about that?
How you tell if they've got diabetes? Yeah. We were told that the traditional way was to look at their shoes, because their urine is full of sugar. And when they go to the loo, men particularly go to the loo, they dribble. And so it dribbles onto the shoes. And if you look at their shoes, they've got flies on them. So that's your diagnosis for diabetes. If somebody's got flies on their shoes, that is the diagnosis for diabetes.
And it's like that make the book turn, I assure you, just like your story about the pen being mightier than the straw. Do you want to? Can you tell people about the pen being mightier than the straw?
Yes.
And I'll come to Giles's question.
Yeah. So I mean, essentially, when we're doing work as Soul City for a group called And Beyond, who own Phinda, the nature reserve, and Ted Turner, who was then married to Jane Fonda, had set up something called the UN Foundation, and he brought his board members to Phinda, and they got myself and my colleague Harriet to come and show them a little bit about what we were doing. So we were sort of rolled out as being, nice examples of good people doing good work. And I arrived, in the afternoon, and this guy roars down the steps to me, the manager, and he says, "Are you a doctor? Are you a doctor?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm a doctor. We've just been, traveling for 16 hours, and we're in this bush lodge. Come quickly, because one of Mr. Turner's guests, who, by the way, were all billionaires in their own right, he has a peanut allergy and he can't breathe." And I just vaguely remember from med school that actually, when that happens, the emergency treatment is you've got to make a hole just below the cricoid cartilage, a little hole here, and you've got to ram something so that they can breathe. So I said, "Take me to the kitchen." And I rushed into the kitchen and grabbed this knife. I said, "Give me your shortest and sharpest knife, and then give me a straw." And I ran with this knife and the straw to where this guy was meant to be. And thank God, and I do thank God, he was no longer there. They put him in a Land Rover and take him into a plane so that they could airlift him out. And we chased the Land Rover, and I was going to try and treat him on the tarmac. And as we arrived, this plane took off. And I suddenly realized, I looked down at my hand, and I had this bloody straw in my hand. And the reality is, if I slit his throat, one of the richest men in the world, slit his throat, put the straw into there, the negative pressure would have just snapped shut, and he then really wouldn't have been able to breathe and would have died. What you need actually is a pen. You take out the ink and you use a pen. So that is why the pen is mightier than the straw.
And that's one of those little stories that, as I say, keeps the 230 pages moving and chuckling, even as you're dealing with weighty matters and deep insights. Giles Griffin, Garth, back to mental health. Can you tell us more about the stuffed head syndrome, the term and the feeling? I think it's worth saying a little bit about that because, as we know, mental health issues is very, very prevalent. And part of the problem of the silence about mental health is people don't know how to recognize problems, and people often live with problems for decades. And it can lead to very, very dire consequences, as you know. So will you just go back to that just for a couple of minutes?
Well, I mean, I think part of, so number one is we've got to break the stigma. The more people like me speak about it, and, so that's what we've got to do. Second is that, help is available. I think part of the problem with mental health is it's not like a broken bone, where I know exactly if you've broken your wrist, there is a treatment, and 98% of times that's going to work. The brain is still, in this day and age, is still not completely understood. And so treatment of mental health issues there's a lot of art involved as well as science. And as a result, people often get quite distressed that they don't get better. In fact, some people get worse when they go into treatment. And so give up and don't realize that actually you've got to keep on going until you find the right solution. And not in all cases. I mean, it's a bit like cancer. You can't cure all cases. There are severe mental health issues that, are treatment resistant. But for the vast majority of people who, suffering from depression or anxiety or whatever, they're both medical and cognitive treatments that are being proven to be hugely successful. So I think reaching out is key. Talking about it is key, but acknowledging that you're starting a journey. It's not like mending a bone. You've got to actually stick with the process, and things can get worse, they can get better. And if it doesn't work here, you don't give up, you keep on looking. It's taken me years actually to get to a point where I now feel like I've got a handle on what to take and when, and I can feel myself when I'm spiraling down. And I know, like January is a bad month for me. I always will increase my dosage in January because it's just something about the beginning of the year and having come off a holiday. So one can manage it in the same way that a diabetic gets to understand their insulin dosage and what to eat. Mental health is something that you have to manage, and it's a lifelong journey.
Thanks, Garth. And I think just what you've said, in the last 10 minutes resonated with some of the 188 people who are still with us. Enoch says, I must thank you for sharing your personal experience with anxiety. It has encouraged me because I'm suffering the same problem. And I think if such a small sample of the population, what you've said has touched a few people, you can see that there are potentially millions of people out there who need to be hearing messages about mental health. I think it's something that Soul City and others should be looking at. The government should be looking at. And of course, there are groups like the South African Depression and Anxiety Group who do wonderful work on this, but we're just not doing enough. And it takes role models like yourself to help break the silence on this question. We're running out of time, unfortunately. I didn't realize it would go so quick, but I want you to, just before we finish, one last thing, which I think is a thread that runs throughout your book, which is faith, religious faith, your Christian faith. I'll admit I'm not a religious person, but the power of the book was that it made me think about the importance of faith and the shape of faith, if you like, of belief. Will you say a little bit? We're almost out of time, but I think I would do an injustice to the book if I don't let you reflect on that for a couple of minutes.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously, particularly when I went through this period of deep darkness and, in my late 20s, just to try and, what's this all about? Where are we going? Where are we from? Does it make any difference? Made me begin to look around and sort of ask the questions. And as I talk about in the book, it actually was it was a story actually that really, it was more the emotions and the resonance with the story. And I often say I'm a very poor Christian, but I hope to be a follower of Jesus, if that makes sense, because actually he was the first, one of the most significant forces for social justice ever. They talk about the upside down kingdom. It was the most unlikely people that he sought out. And so that was my journey to faith, which initially started as a cerebral thing, was just the unlikelihood of that story, and what resonated for me as somebody, I don't know why, but have always sort of rooted for the underdog and have felt very passionately about making a difference there, that was a connection. So yeah, I mean, that in itself is a story and a journey. And I make the point that all the great faiths are story-based, and it's not surprising because since we walked out of the cave, as I said, that's how we passed on what is normal, what is not normal. But this is not a proselytizing book. It's not about trying to persuade people to come to any form of faith. It's just saying these different stories. It was a story that was told that actually led to significant, changes in my own life. So that's the faith part.
Thank you, and very well described. Garth, we pretty much time up. We've only scratched the surface, but I hope that it has given people a feeling of this really touching, and as I say, beautifully written book as well. In my life before being an activist, I'm a student of literature, English and African literature, and it ticks all my boxes on that count as well. Wonderfully evocative. So here we are, 2021, COVID-19. It's March the 18th. You talk in the book about how you wait for cat's eyes to show you things in the future that you need to be doing. So let's just sum up. Where are you now, Garth? What's for you the future, and what are for us what you think are all of our key priorities? And if you can do that in 2 minutes, I'll give you an award.
First of all, if the writing's good, it's because I had an extraordinary editor. Alison Lowry she should be co-author of this book. She was just amazing. I mean, again, I think that the danger for all of us is being completely overawed by the multitude of problems around us and forgetting our humanity. And so, the starfish principle of reaching out one person at a time, of doing the small thing of listening to each other's stories. I think, like you, I have the great fortune to interact with a lot of extraordinary people. And I think we, as a country, we both lived through the early 90s where things seemed, we were headed for civil war, and we were. The facts are not always where you're going to go. The facts look like they're going in a certain direction. So I'm a believer that actually there is a resilience and a strangeness about our trajectory. But it comes down just to the way that us as individuals lead our lives. And so I've got to start with me. So that's the way. And then as Heartlines, a big thing for us is promoting the concept of men's presence in the lives of children. So beyond the river, I mean, what's your story is key. And then this issue of fathering and the importance of men in our society. So those are the things, Mark. And just to thank you and Maverick and ask people to buy the book. The proceeds actually go to Heartlines, so that we can continue the work we do. So you can get it from us, from Heartlines, you can get it from all leading bookstores, Loot, Take a Lot. It's on Amazon. You can order it anywhere in the world as Kindle or as an as a printed book. That's features just become available. So, and hopefully it'll make you laugh. There's, it sounds like a hell of a heavy book, but actually, hopefully there was some nice parts in that. So, yeah.
No, it does. It makes you laugh and it makes you think, and it's an easy read of the right sort. So thank you, Garth. I mean, just in your closing comments, we could have started a whole new conversation, particularly this issue of men's presence in the lives of children, which you do talk about as you draw towards the end of the book. But people know where to look now to find Heartlines and to find this important type of work. So thanks for what you've done. Not just you, thanks for Soul City and all your colleagues, and thanks for Heartlines and all your colleagues in what you've done to try and make our society a better society. Thanks for everybody who's been with us today and stuck with us for the last hour and a couple of minutes. Thanks to Pan Macmillan for publishing this important book and doing a good job in promoting it from what I can see. And thanks to the people at the Daily Maverick, Nicole in particular, who's the behind-the-scenes maestro that makes these things come off effectively. So good afternoon, everybody. I hope that you got something from this. I hope in some ways it might have changed, that it will have changed your life and that you'll do things differently from 1:05 on the 18th of March. Good afternoon and take care and stay safe. Thank you all. Thanks, Garth. Bye.
Thanks so much, Mark.